Good evening, my friends. Wherever you are in the world tonight, whether it is midnight in Paris, dawn in Tokyo, or twilight by the sea, I invite you to rest your mind and travel with me. Tonight's story drifts through the misty rivers of ancient Gaul, through centuries of faith, power, and remembrance. It is the tale of Clovis, the warrior who became a believer, and of his sons who carried both the sword and the cross, the sons of the wolf, and the founders of what would one day become the heart of Europe. Let the firelight fade. Let the river speak. And let us begin the long journey of the sons of Clovis. The river remembered before anyone else did. It ran dark and patient beneath a sky the color of beaten pewter, its surface holding a faint image of the moon even after dawn had unpinned the night. Reeds leaned and straightened with the breath of winter. Somewhere far off, a bell. One of those Roman things that had learned to live in a Frankish throat, trembled and went quiet again, as if embarrassed to be heard so early. On the bank stood a boy with winter in his eyes. They called him Clodovecius in the old syllables that tasted of iron and smoke. Later, a softened world would call him Clovis. His hair was the color of damp straw. He wore a short cloak lined with fur and a tunic coarsely woven, the sort of cloth that remembers the sheep. He did not fidget. The wind tugged at him as if testing his name, and he let it. To his left rose the palisade of Tournai, posts dark with rain, the gate still latched, torches guttering out from the long night. To his right, beyond the bend of the river Scheldt, an old Roman road, faded, stubborn, ran away into mist the way a sentence runs toward its verb. The road had lost its empire, but not its grammar. "Listen," said the old warrior beside him. The man's beard held the frost the way a net holds fish. "The river is a teacher. Hear how it keeps speaking even when no one answers." "What does it say?" the boy asked. "That kingdoms are bridges," the man said, "and bridges belong to water first." The boy nodded as if he understood. And perhaps he did. Some children carry comprehension the way others carry luck. Without having ordered it, without being believed, behind them the timber hall woke. Hounds shook rain from their coats and sneezed. In the smoke-smelling dimness, women stirred grain into porridge and broke yesterday's bread along its remembered cracks. A pair of ravens settled on the roof beam and argued in throaty consonants that could have been a prayer if anyone had cared to translate. The boy watched the river move around a fallen branch. He breathed out, and his breath made a small flag in the cold. "Again," said the warrior, handing him the practice blade. Clovis squared his feet on the slick earth and lifted the wood sword until his shoulders ached and his elbows learned, once more, not to lie. The first blow thudded against the man's shield. The second slid off the rim and nearly took the boy with it. He grimaced, recovered, raised it again. "Not rage," said the warrior. "Winter. Winter? You strike like fire. Fire is splendid, and then it is gone. Strike like cold. Hold, bite, stay." The boy swallowed, set his jaw, and struck as if the morning had no other purpose than to memorize him. In the longhouse, Childeric warmed his hands above a shallow brazier and watched the door without appearing to. He smelled of horse and oiled leather and the faint sweetness of honey that clung to a beard after feasts. His cloak, pinned with a disk of worked bronze, fell the way certainty falls, not heavy, but unavoidable. A messenger stood before him, mud dried in a geography on his boots. He spoke the language of Rome in a provincial key that made the consonants honest. Syagrius holds Soissons still, the man said. He calls himself king of the Romans, and the towns answer him with a kind of sigh. A man can name himself anything, said Childeric, until someone else names him differently. He pays well for quiet borders. Quiet is a stallion that throws its rider, said the king. Tell him the Franks are listening. The messenger bowed, grateful to be dismissed before the wolves woke in any man's eyes. At the far end of the hall, women lifted a curtain and let in the pale sheet of day. A seeress, hair white as wool, traced symbols in ash on the floor and frowned at what they refused to become. The wolf, she murmured, not for the first time. And a waterside vow. Speak plain, Childeric said. The river wants a word from your son, she replied, and the word wants a crown. He is a boy. So is dawn, she said, until it isn't. The day stretched itself like a cat, and then gave up pretending to be warm. Clovis ate at the side table. Porridge and an end of cheese, a nub of apple. That practical mercy of winter. A dog set its head on his knee and received a strip of rind for piety. You were made for stillness, his mother told him, passing behind his chair with a small lamp. Do not let men teach you to mistake noise for action. He tilted his face toward her and caught a scent of beeswax and rosemary from the hem of her veil. When will father let me ride with him? When the river says so, she answered. The river speaks to women more than to men, he dared to say. Because we carry water, she said, inside and out. She smiled then, that brief country where a boy can winter. The first campaign he remembered smelled of wet wool and iron. He rode at the back of the column, where the breath of the horses made small weather, and the road kept offering up stones that had once been part of something the Romans loved. The wolf-head standard went before them, its fur dark, its glass eyes bright with whatever fire found them. They passed villas whose tiled roofs had learned to fail gracefully, arches that held up pieces of sky as if they had been patterned for it. Milestones that had forgotten their numbers but kept their purpose, to stand, to witness. In villages, people watched them without moving, faces like unlit lamps. At the camp by the Lys, a trader in a patched cloak sold lengths of dyed wool and a bundle of small bronze crosses. For luck, he said, for the Christian God who makes roads out of storms. Roads are made by feet. The soldier laughed, counting out copper. Feet are made by God. The trader returned, because any sentence can be carried to heaven if you walk long enough. That night, the boy lay awake and listened to the audible sleep of men, the clicking of harness, the mindless language of embers. Somewhere, a priest's voice murmured Latin that someone had taught to him with a kindness no one would think to record. Somewhere else, a woman sang a lullaby to a child who would grow up remembering the shape of her voice better than her face. You hear too much, said the warrior, who wore sleep like a second skin. I hear just enough, the boy whispered back. In Soissons, he learned how pride smells, like civic stone after rain, like a market that believes its prices. Syagrius received Childeric with the long breath of a man who had practiced dignity as a form of prayer. Behind him, mosaics climbed walls in the patient grammar of glass, telling Roman stories to Gallic light. You come as ally? Syagrius asked. As neighbor, Childeric said. And if the neighborhood grows noisy? Then we will build thicker walls, the Frank replied, or teach the noise to carry a tune. Syagrius looked at the boy beside his father. The cautious gaze, the careful stillness, the hand that rested on the belt not out of vanity, but for balance. This is the sun. Clovis, said Childeric, as if naming weather. Do you read? Syagrius asked the boy, and did not wait for the answer. He gestured. The scribe set a book upon a table, psalms in an elegant hand, letters that made the page look like it had learned to breathe. Clovis bent, not out of reverence, but curiosity. The ink smelled faintly of vinegar and smoke. He could not yet follow the Latin as a road, but he could stand in it as in a river and feel the current tug at his legs. Words are spears, Syagrius said quietly. They pierce later than iron does, and deeper. Childeric's mouth turned. And yet your walls require my spears. The Roman smiled without brightness. Walls and words keep different wolves. That night in the guest hall, Clovis ate more slowly than he meant to. Music rose. Strings in the small bronze that keeps time without bruising it. A young woman with a veil like a pale thought moved between the lamps carrying bread as if it were a blessing that needed her hands. Later, the seeress from Tournai found him under a portico, counting the 7 stars a priest had taught him. Rome loves endings that pretend to be beginnings, she said. Look and learn the trick. What trick? To survive while vanishing, she said. To vanish while surviving. Winter returned with its old economy. The world shrank to the distance a man could walk before the sun chose a different field. Ice bit the river and found that it could not finish the job. Any more than hunger can eat a village to death if the women are stubborn. Childeric fell ill and rose again, the way a king must. Men swore themselves to him over meat and oaths, and then went to sleep in barns scented with hay, and the iron truth of animal heat. The boy grew. His wrists learned to catch what his eyes missed. His ears learned to weigh what a mouth intended against what a sentence betrayed. Sometimes he rode alone along a Romanized track beyond the marsh, where the wind could take a thought, make it walk in front of you like a strayed dog. On such a ride, he came upon an old milestone half swallowed by moss. It wore a Latin that time had taught to hold its tongue. He dismounted and touched the stone as if to wake it gently. Tell me, he asked it, how to be a road and not a ditch. The stone, being a stone, answered by standing. He was perhaps 17 when he first met a woman whose name would strike flint inside him. It was not the meeting the chronicles would later embroider. No processions, no treaties on a table, but a glimpse caught as if by accident, which is to say by fate, without ceremony. The retinue had stopped near a chapel scarcely larger than a good thought. A relic slept under stone. A priest with hands like vines whispered the prescribed sentences. Clovis entered for the cool and the curiosity. A small oil lamp made a honey pool on the floor. Smoke wrote soft letters no one could read. She knelt near the altar, a veil falling like water over her hair. Her profile suggested both strength and surrender. She did not move, and in her stillness he recognized a thing he had been practicing without a name. Later, a courtier said, "A Burgundian princess, Clotilde." The line is complicated. The blood, perhaps more honest than its history. The boy said nothing. He had no right yet to a say in the arithmetic of dynasties. But that night the lamp's honey lit his sleep. When Childeric died, the hall did not learn it from a shout, but from the way breath changed its shape in men. The news crawled along beams and settled in blankets. The dogs lifted their heads and then put them down. A bishop came, carrying a cross that had learned how to be heavy. Clovis stood very straight and let grief arrive without asking it to explain itself. At the funeral, the seeress touched his sleeve. "The river wants its word," she said. "Which word?" "Yours." The boy who had practiced winter stood at the center of the living and the dead and spoke softly. He did not promise the impossible. He did not threaten the inevitable. He said only, "We will keep the roads. We will keep the bridges. We will keep the grain safe from fire and mouths safe from hunger." Men heard a king because he talked to the river first. The first season of his reign was made of lists and looks. Lists of oxen and spears, of barns whose roofs knew how to leak in a moral way, of men who could read and men who could be read. Looks that weighed loyalty, that measured the distance between an oath and the hand that gave it, that understood how fear curdles into treachery if left too long in the cold. He kept the wolf-head standard, not to worship, but to remember what teeth feel like. Beside it, he set a small cross of oak given by a priest whose name he forgot and whose kindness he kept. At council, he listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, the room turned its head the way wheat turns to wind. Syagrius tested him with sentences that had been taught how to wear armor. Neighboring chiefs tested him with horses and men. He answered with patience, as if it were a blade. "Why not strike now?" asked a captain whose blood obeyed drums. "Because the river is high," Clovis said. "Because the barns are low. Because the roads are half-mended lies, and I would like them to be whole sentences." The captain frowned, then grinned like a man whose ale had been improved. "A whole sentence, then. We will write it in iron in grain first," said the king. "Iron later." On a night when the sun forgot to rise, he walked the palisade alone. The guard kept his distance, the way wisdom keeps from interrupting a thought. Owls rewrote darkness into smaller darknesses. Somewhere a woman laughed. Somewhere a child refused sleep with a conviction emperors might envy. He sank to one knee and put his palm on the timber as if it were a living flank. "If there is a God who minds roads and rain," he said into the unlit air, "show me the hinge of this door." No answer came except the correct one, wind taking nothing personally. He stood, steadied, and knew the hinge would show itself at a field whose name the future would pronounce in another accent. Tolbiac, but not yet. The word hung at the edge of his breath, like a promise that has not learned how to be forgiven if kept. The year turned. The Scheldt swelled with melt and repentance. Markets remembered their verbs. A boy ran along the quay, shouting that fish had returned to the weirs like coins to a miser's hand. Women laughed and scolded and bought, which is the trinity that keeps a city alive. Clovis rode out between showers to the edge where Roman memory gives up and forest begins. He dismounted, let the reins fall, and went on a little way by foot, listening for the sound a boundary makes when it begins to soften. "Majesty," said the captain at his shoulder, "do you smell smoke?" "Pins and rain," said Clovis. "The smoke is tomorrow." He turned back then, not because he feared the wood, but because he had learned to teach men that a king returns when he means to, not when the path forces him. At the gate a monk waited with a letter that smelled of wax and wrote. "From Reims," the man said, offering both parchment and humility. "From Bishop Remigius." Clovis broke the seal carefully, as if the wax were skin. The letter spoke like a measured river, of peace and patience, of a God who likes roads, of a world that will not hold without a blessing to remember what it is for. He folded it, placed it inside his cloak, and said to no one, "I am listening." In the evenings, he sometimes visited the small chapel by the granary, the one a mason had built from stones that used to be a Roman bath, and now were learning to heat a different kind of water. He would sit in the last row and watch light pull itself along the wall like honey escaping a jar. When the priest asked if he wished confession, he shook his head. "I want instruction," he said. "In what?" "In how to carry a crown without putting it down on another man's throat." The priest smiled the way a tired man smiles at a true question. "Begin," he said, "by feeding him." Clovis nodded, stood, and left a coin that would buy oil for 3 weeks and bread for 2 nights. Spring provoked color out of the hedges and invited rumors out of men. Word came from the east, where hills remember winters with the cruelty of old loves. The Alemanni had stirred. Word came from the south, where the Seine writes poems to bridges. The Romans under Syagrius had grown softer in their hardness and harder in their softness, which is the sort of sentence that marks the end of an age. Theuderic? Yes, that name would matter later. Yes, blood is a map. Rode in with news that wore the dust of long miles. "They will not wait forever," he said. "Nor will the river," Clovis replied. He looked past the messenger to the line of trees shaking out their new leaves like coins from a sleeve. "But we will not run. We will arrive." He raised the old standard then, the wolf head whose fur the years had taught humility. Beside it he set the small cross of oak. The men saw and felt some piece of themselves stand up straighter inside their armor. "We march at first light," he said. "We mend where we pass. We leave a road behind us and take a future with us." In the hush that followed, the river bent the light toward evening the way a king bends an argument toward law. Night gathered. The longhouse hummed with the industry of departure. Pack straps tested, edges checked with a thumb, bread wrapped in linen that had know how to be clean. A child, in the careless generosity of children, offered the king a sprig of thyme. He tucked it into his belt as if it were a talisman the old gods and the new might both respect. The seeress stopped him at the door. "Do not mistake victory for proof," she said. "Proof of what?" "That you were right," she said. "Victory proves only that someone failed to stop you." He bowed his head to the old woman's arrogance, which is to say, her love. Then he stepped out into a night so quiet the stars seemed to be listening for their names. The river went on speaking, because that is its vow. And somewhere ahead, beyond the borders where winter had first taught him patience, a field waited to be named in a language he was not yet ready to own. He would learn it, but not tonight. Tonight, there was only the sound of leather, the soft clink of iron, the hush of men who have chosen to be a single animal for as long as morning requires, and the knowledge, cold, clean, necessary, that a crown is a road you walk until it admits it is a bridge. The year of Tolbiac began with a silence so wide that even the snow seemed to be listening. The fields lay under their white burden like parchment, waiting for a word. Trees stood black against the sky, gaunt and certain. The river moved sluggishly, as if too weary to remember its own current. And in the valleys where the frost gathered thickest, fires of the Frankish war camps burned like small, stubborn thoughts that refused to die. Word had come from the east, Alemanni raiders crossing rivers with the arrogance of hunger. Word had come that they burned villages and mocked the baptized, that they rode under banners older than mercy. For days, Clovis said nothing. He walked the ramparts of his stronghold at Soissons and watched the smoke of the hearths rise in narrow, disciplined columns. "They will test us again," said Theuderic, who had ridden hard from the frontier. "Let them," Clovis answered. His voice was calm, the way still water is calm when it hides its depth. He turned to the horizon. Beyond the forests and rivers, the winter light fell like metal shavings from a broken sword. "If they want a storm," he said quietly, "we will meet them in its eye." The council was held in a hall that smelled of wax and smoke, its beams carved with symbols no priest dared translate. Warriors gathered, some with crosses around their necks, others with the amulets of their fathers still hidden beneath their armor. Between them, a kind of truce hung in the air. Half faith, half fear, all obedience. "The Alemanni are fierce," said a captain, "and they have nothing to lose. They are not Romans, not Christians, not bound by any law that knows the shape of mercy." "Then we will teach them mercy," Clovis replied, "in the language they understand." The men laughed softly, the way soldiers do when humor and dread are indistinguishable. "But winter fights for no one," said another. "The fields give us nothing. The horses tire, the gods are silent." "Gods," murmured Clovis. He looked at his captains, each man's face lit by the trembling firelight, half in gold, half in shadow. "If they are silent, perhaps they listen. If they listen, perhaps they wait." He dismissed them then, and the murmur of armor faded into the distance. Only the sound of the river remained, moving somewhere beyond the wall, an ancient reminder that nothing ever stops. It only changes its name. That night, the king sat alone. The candle beside him burned low. Its flame made the bronze cup on the table glimmer like a promise half kept. He unrolled the letter from Reims, from Bishop Remigius. The ink faded slightly where it had been folded too long. "To the most noble king of the Franks," it said, "whose valor we know and whose destiny we cannot yet measure. I pray that the one God guide your steps. For the strength of kings lies not only in the arm, but in the heart that chooses its faith wisely." He read the lines again, slower this time, as though the spaces between the words held the answer he could not yet name. A hand touched his shoulder. "You read as if the parchment might bleed," said a voice behind him. Clotilde stepped into the light, her face calm, her eyes deep with a faith that had not yet been proven wrong. Her gown was dark wool, her veil simple, but she carried with her the air of those who have spoken too often with angels to fear men. "You pray for me," he said. "Always," she replied. "And your God?" "He prays for you as well." The king smiled faintly, though his eyes did not soften. "If he knows what I must do, he will forgive me before I begin." "If you would only ask him," she said, "perhaps you would not need forgiveness." He looked at her for a long moment. The silence between them was not hostility, but distance. A gulf carved by centuries of faiths staring at one another across the same fire. "You're Christ," he said quietly. "Does he love warriors?" "He loves the broken," she answered, "and every warrior breaks." The candle guttered between them, its flame bowing low like a supplicant. In the days that followed, the army gathered. Men came from the valleys of the Seine and the forests of the Ardennes, from villages that had forgotten Latin but remembered loyalty. They came with spears, with shields painted in fading ochres, with wives who walked beside them until the last bridge. The air filled with the sounds of iron and farewells. The night before the march, Clovis walked through the camp alone. The fires glowed in small circles, each one a universe of fatigue and faith. He saw men sharpening blades, mending sandals, whispering prayers to gods that had never met. He saw a soldier pressing a small wooden cross into the hand of his son. He saw another, older, rubbing his sword hilt with oil as though polishing a memory. A voice stopped him. "Majesty," said an old Frank, rising stiffly to bow, "do you dream before battles?" "Sometimes," Clovis said, "but not tonight." "Then you will see clearly," said the old man. "Dreams are for the living. Tomorrow is for the dead." Clovis laid a hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps," he said, "but I intend to be both by morning." The man laughed once, quietly, and the king moved on. They marched at dawn. The mist clung low to the ground, veiling the horizon. The horses' hooves broke the frost with a sound like distant applause. As the sun climbed, pale and uncertain, the valley of Tolbiac opened before them. Broad, bleak, and white, the Alemanni waited beyond the river. Their banners hung with skulls bleached to the color of milk. Their chieftain stood tall on a rise, bareheaded, hair braided with bone. He raised his spear in salute and smiled, a gesture that promised nothing except recognition. "They are fewer than we thought," said Theodoric. "They are enough," Clovis answered. He rode forward, the wolf-head standard lifting in the wind, the fur stiff with cold. Around him, his captains formed a crescent of iron. Behind them, the Franks roared their war chant, the deep, rolling growl of men who fight not for glory, but for memory. The first clash was not sound, but sensation. The jolt of weight meeting weight, the crack of shield against shield, the wet percussion of bodies yielding to steel. Snow turned to mud, then to something darker. The air filled with shouts, prayers, curses, and the metallic hiss of breath through bloodied teeth. Clovis fought at the center, his sword moving like a verdict. The world had narrowed to a rhythm. Strike, breathe, step, strike again. Time dissolved. The light changed without his noticing. When his arm faltered, he looked up and saw the wolf standard tilt, its pole snapping halfway. For a heartbeat, fear slipped through the ranks like a shadow. Then came the whisper, first among the wounded, then the dying. "The gods are silent." Clovis heard it. He felt it in his bones, the echo of an age ending. He fell to one knee in the churned snow, sword buried to the hilt, the sky above him empty of omen. "If you exist," he said into the void, "and if you are the god of Clotilde, grant me victory, and I will believe. I will bow. I will be baptized. I will name you above all others. Only let my people live." The wind stilled. The sky did not answer. But light, thin, silver, improbable, broke through the clouds and struck the broken banner. The wolf's head blazed as though remembering the sun. The men saw it. They shouted. And for reasons no chronicler can explain, the tide turned. The Alemanni faltered. Their chieftain fell with an arrow in his throat. The battle ended not with triumph, but with exhaustion, the kind that blurs victory into survival. Clovis stood amid the ruin, his sword heavy, his breath clouding the dusk. Snow began to fall again, slow, wide flakes that landed on blood and made no distinction. He whispered, "You heard me." Weeks later, the king rode to Rams. The city rose pale against the gray sky. its towers blackened by old fires, its bells timid as birds. The people lined the streets, some crossing themselves, others only watching as they might watch a storm passing close. In the cathedral, Bishop Remigius waited, robed in white and gold, his face serene as water. The air was thick with incense and awe. Candles flickered along the nave like a line of small suns. Clovis approached the font, the wolf standard now a relic folded at his feet. "Bend your head, proud Sicambrian," said the bishop. "Burn what you have worshipped, and worship what you have burned." The words struck him like a hammer, softened by mercy. He closed his eyes as the water touched his forehead. Cold, clean, unarguable. Outside, the bells of Rheims began to ring. Their sound traveled through the streets, over the fields, down to the river where the mist still lingered. Clotilde knelt among the people, tears shining like glass in her lashes. And for the first time in his life, Clovis felt something greater than conquest. The stillness of a soul that had found its mirror. That night, in the quiet after celebration, he sat alone before the open doors of the cathedral. The wind moved through, carrying the scent of wax and rain. A young acolyte approached timidly. "My lord," he said, "what do you see?" Clovis looked at the darkness beyond the threshold. "A kingdom that must learn to pray with the same discipline it fights," he said. "And will it? It will try. And trying is the first miracle." He stood, the moonlight glinting off the damp curls of his hair, and turned toward the river that had followed him all his life. It whispered again, patient as ever, asking no questions, making no demands, only reminding him that faith, like water, reshapes what it touches. The king lifted his hand as if in salute to the unseen current. "We begin again," he said. And somewhere in the cold dark of the east, the wolves howled, not in mourning, but in recognition. They said that the wolf had laid down beside the cross. But the knights of Gaul still howled. The reign of Clovis had ended with hymns and silence, and in that silence the kingdom multiplied like echoes in stone halls. His sons, 4 in number, 4 winds pulling at a single crown, rose each in their corner of the realm, bearing not only his blood but his ghosts. Yet before the quarrels and the crowns, there was a brief season of light. A few golden years when the rivers ran clear, the granaries were full, and the scent of peace hung over Gaul like incense that refuses to fade. The world had changed. Rome was no longer a voice, but a memory that hummed through the stones of broken villas and forgotten roads. In the markets, Latin mingled with the rougher Frankish speech, birthing a new tongue made of compromise. In the churches, Latin psalms rose over the guttural prayers of men who still whispered to older gods under their breath. The air itself seemed layered, holy and pagan, civilized and wild, like the twin scents of myrrh and smoke from a hearth. The farmers of Champagne said that since Clovis's baptism, the seasons had steadied. The rains came more gently, the vines grew thicker. They built new granaries beside the old ones, roofs of thatch covering stones that had once belonged to temples. When they crossed themselves before planting seed, they still glanced toward the forest edge, just in case Wotan was listening, offended but not yet gone. At night, the villages glowed softly from hearths burning willow logs. Children fell asleep to stories told by grandmothers who remembered both the Roman taxes and the Frankish raids. They told of a time when men wore sandals and read from scrolls, and another time when they wore furs and spoke to thunder. Now they wore both and spoke of both, because the world had decided it would no longer choose. In the royal villa at Paris, Childebert held court. The hall was a blend of two worlds: marble fragments from Roman ruins built into walls of timber, frescoes half-faded beside new carvings of wolves, lilies, and saints. The king sat on a high chair draped in fox fur, a cross above his head, a sword beside his knee. Clerics from Tours brought letters sealed with wax, the scent of incense still clinging to them. Bishops spoke of canon law, of relics and baptisms. Captains spoke of bridges and tribute. Merchants came bearing silk from the south and salt from the Atlantic, and their tongues tripped between the names of gods and coins. One of them, a gray-bearded trader from Bordeaux, bowed and said, "My lord, the roads are safer now. Pilgrims travel to shrines without fear. Even the vineyards of the Loire sing again." Childebert smiled faintly. "Then let the land rest," he said. "But tell your priests to bless the vines. God favors the diligent." A murmur of agreement filled the hall. But later, alone, the king stood at the balcony overlooking the city. The river Seine wound below, like a silver script he could almost read, but not quite translate. Smoke rose from the sacristries, mingling with the dusk. Bells tolled from the new churches, bells cast from melted spears of war. "Peace," he whispered, "is a word that demands more work than battle." Behind him, his scribe waited with a quill. But the king did not turn. He watched the city breathe until the last light sank into the river. In Orléans, Clodomir ruled differently. He liked noise, feasts, hunts, the clash of armor and laughter. His men adored him for it. His palace was filled with hounds and horns and the sound of music that had not yet learned restraint. He was the most like his father in body and fire. The priest said he carried the spirit of the old gods in his veins. The soldiers said he carried the heart of a storm. When he rode through the countryside, children ran behind his horse shouting, "The King of Thunder!" And he would toss them coins or apples from his saddlebag. Yet there were nights when even thunder doubts itself. One evening, returning from the hunt, Clodomir entered the chapel where his mother, Queen Clotilde, prayed. The candles threw their light upward, painting her face in soft gold. She looked older, yes, but not diminished. Her eyes held that quiet flame that no grief could extinguish. "Mother," he said, lowering his voice, "why do you still pray so long?" "Because my sons still fight," she answered. "Not with swords. With ambition," she said. "It cuts more cleanly." He knelt beside her, the scent of leather and rain clinging to his cloak. "I would give the world for our name to live forever. And if the world must die for it?" He hesitated, staring at the crucifix above the altar. "Then I will pray that it forgives me." She touched his hair gently. "Then pray harder." In the eastern provinces, Theuderic ruled with colder wisdom. His lands were rougher, full of forests and hill forts. The tribes there were fierce, half subdued. He had inherited his father's discipline, but none of his warmth. His soldiers respected him as one respects the edge of a sword, useful, bright, and best not questioned. He kept roads clear and rivers patrolled. He sent surveyors to measure land and priests to measure souls. His letters were few but exact. His judgments swift and without embellishment. Yet he too had his ghosts. In the dark of winter, he would ride to the ruins of Trier, a Roman city long dead, and stand before the broken arches. Snow drifted through the empty forums where senators once debated the shape of the world. They built for eternity, he said to his general, and eternity forgot their names. And us, my lord? We build for memory, he said. It dies slower. The general crossed himself and said no more. The youngest, Clothar, ruled from Soissons, the old Roman stronghold. He was not yet 20, but his mind was sharper than the blades that guarded him. He listened more than he spoke. He had learned that silence draws truth the way honey draws flies. In council, when his older brothers argued, he often stayed quiet, tracing circles on the table with his finger. When they demanded his opinion, he would smile and offer one sentence that ended the quarrel. Clothar has the patience of the grave, said one captain. And the curiosity of the serpent, said another. Both were right. Beyond the palaces, the people lived their small, bright lives between famine and feast. In the markets of Paris, the air smelled of fish and wine. Women bargained in 2 languages, switching between Latin and Frankish mid-sentence. Priests walked among them, blessing bread and gossip alike. Children ran barefoot, chasing dogs. Old men whittled wooden charms that combined the shapes of crosses and hammers, just in case. Along the Loire, blacksmiths sang at their anvils, shaping plowshares and swords with equal reverence. Both feed men, they said, one with bread, one with courage. In monasteries, monks copied psalms by candlelight, the sound of quills scratching like rain on the roof. They wrote on parchment made from calfskin, each letter a small act of defiance against forgetting. One novice wrote in the margin, "The sons of Clovis are 4, but the shadow they cast is 1." Yet peace in those days was a coin with 2 faces. In taverns, men whispered of jealousy between the brothers. Rumor said Theudoric's soldiers demanded tribute from lands claimed by Childebert. Others swore that Clodomir had set his eye on Burgundy, that he would march before summer's end. The queen heard these whispers and prayed harder. She had seen too many kingdoms undone by blood that refused to remember it was kin. "My sons," she told the priest at Tours, "are like rivers. They feed the same sea but tear at their banks." The priest nodded. "Then pray that the sea is merciful." She looked at the crucifix. The sea never is. When word came that the Burgundian king Sigismund had executed his own son in a fit of rage, the world trembled. Theuderic saw opportunity. Clodomir saw vengeance. The queen, hearing of their plans, sent a messenger to her sons. "Do not make war for pride," her letter said. "Make it only if you can bring peace with you when you return." But kings seldom read their mother's words as warnings. They read them as prophecies. So the armies gathered once more. Along the Loire, fords churned with horses. Men carried spears, banners, crosses. The wolf standard was there, faded but still breathing. Beside it flew the sign of the cross, sewn in white thread on blue silk. The queen stood on the riverbank to bless them. Her veil fluttered in the wind. The water mirrored her face, and for a moment she seemed both above and within it, a woman and a reflection of the land itself. "Be merciful in victory," she called out, "and faithful in defeat." The armies cheered. She smiled but did not wave. As the river swallowed the sound of drums, she whispered, "God, keep them from themselves." The war that followed was swift and terrible. Burgundy burned. Sigismund's castles fell one by one. In the city of Vézérance, the fields turned red with rain and blood together. The brothers won the day, but at a cost. Clodomir, reckless and radiant, led the charge into the heart of the enemy. A spear struck him beneath the ribs. He fell, shouting a prayer that half the field would later claim to have heard in their own tongue. When his body was brought back to Orléans, wrapped in the torn banner of his house, the bells of Tours rang without ceasing for 3 days. The queen received the news without sound. She sat long after the messenger left, her hand resting on the arm of her chair, as if on the shoulder of a child long gone. "He was brave," said her confessor softly. "So is fire," she answered. After the burial, the 3 surviving brothers met in Paris. The hall was quiet, the torches burning low. Between them stood Clodomir's 3 small sons, eyes wide, hands clutching one another. "They are heirs," said Childebert. "They should inherit their father's lands." "Children cannot rule," said Clothar. "A realm needs hands, not cradles." "Then we shall guard them," said Theuderic, but his voice lacked conviction. The argument grew sharp and thin, like the edge of a blade. In the end, ambition won. History will call it necessity. Faith will call it sin. The truth is quieter. It was fear. Fear that the realm would fracture, that power divided would never heal. When it was done, silence fell like a lid over the world. The queen heard the news at dawn. She did not scream. She only whispered, "So the sons of the wolf have begun to eat their own." Then she walked to the chapel and prayed until night forgot her. The following years were heavy with consequence. Theuderic turned east again, building fortresses and laws. Childebert sought penance in piety, founding churches and hospitals, trying to drown the echo of his brother's voice in the sound of psalms. Clothar consolidated, patient as frost, gathering the realm piece by piece until only his name filled the horizon. The queen aged like marble, unchanged but slowly colder. She spent her days among nuns at Tours, teaching children to read prayers they did not yet understand. Sometimes she would smile at their laughter, and for a heartbeat, the light returned to her face. "Are you sad, my lady?" a little girl once asked. "No," Clotilde said softly. "I am remembering." "Remembering what?" "The sound of my sons before they became kings." In the markets, life went on. Bread rose, bells rang. Lovers met in the shadows of churches. Farmers sang as they sowed. And yet, in their songs, the names of kings had changed, from heroes to warnings. "The sons of the wolf," they whispered, made a crown of their mother's tears. Still, the river moved. The land healed as land always does, with patience. Monks recorded, priests preached, smiths forged. A new generation grew up that no longer remembered the sound of Roman sandals or the names of the old gods. They remembered instead the feel of stone underfoot, the tolling of bells, the weight of words written on vellum. And somewhere deep in the heart of the realm, in the quiet where all history eventually rests, the spirit of the wolf and the spirit of the cross lay side by side, breathing in rhythm. The city of Tours woke slowly, the way an old man wakes, aching, grateful, uncertain that the dawn still bothers with him. Mist rolled down from the Loire, softening rooftops and bells, wrapping the spires of St. Martin's Basilica in veils of milk-white light. The first sound was the chant of monks at matins, low, rhythmic, half asleep. And then the market began. Carts creaking, geese complaining, women calling out the price of bread in voices that belonged equally to prayer and survival. From her high window, Queen Clotilde watched the city breathe. She no longer wore jewels. Her fingers were bare, her hair entirely white. Her gown was wool, undyed, simple. The only brightness about her was in her eyes, eyes that had watched empires fall and suns rise. The servants called her the Queen of Prayers. The people called her the Mother of the Franks. To her, she was neither. She was simply a woman who had outlived her world. The Loire ran beneath her balcony like an old friend who refuses to leave, muttering stories to itself. On clear days, she could see barges drifting, timber from the forests, sacks of grain, casks of salt. Boys waited by the banks, their laughter carrying through the fog like church bells at play. "They are free," she whispered once to her maid, watching them. "I envy them." The maid smiled, thinking it jest. "They envy you, my lady. They would trade their rags for your crown." "Crowns," Clotilde said softly, "are cages you wear on the head." In the marketplace below, life was loud and stubborn. Farmers from the valleys came with carts of turnips and onions. Potters sold bowls painted with saints beside others still marked with pagan spirals. A blind harper sang verses about the miracles of St. Martin. And next to him, an old woman sold charms carved from bone. Against fever, against heartbreak, against the evil eye. "Do they work?" a boy asked her, fingering one. "All things work if you believe," the woman replied, "even tears." The language of the market was a music of its own. Latin words mangled by Frankish tongues, old Celtic syllables that clung to bread and wine. "Panem brot," "pain shod." The people laughed at their own confusion and understood one another anyway. Bells tolled from the abbey as merchants crossed themselves, and the smell of fresh bread mixed with incense drifting from open church doors. The queen sometimes walked among them, veiled, without escort. She would buy figs or honey, not because she needed them, but because it pleased her to be part of the noise. "You walk like a ghost," a child once told her, tugging at her sleeve. "Then I am a kind ghost," she smiled. "I bring no harm." "Ghosts cannot smile," said the child solemnly. "Then perhaps I am something else entirely," she replied, and pressed a coin into his hand. At dusk, she returned to the quiet of her palace, a Roman villa remade by Frankish hands. The walls still bore fragments of painted vines, faded but patient. Between them hung crucifixes and tapestries embroidered by nuns. Saints in gold thread, lilies in white silk. Her chamber was simple: a bed of oak, a chair by the fire, a small chest that held her letters. She opened it often. From Theuderic came dispatches written in the hand of a soldier, firm, clipped, impatient. "The Thuringians submit. The Saxons bend but will not break. The harvest will be enough if the river behaves." From Childebert came parchment scented faintly with incense. "We have raised another church in Paris. The bishop says my faith will outlive my crown." From Clothar came fewer words, darker ink. "The men are loyal. The iron forges burn well. I think of father often." She touched each seal as one touches the heads of children who no longer fit in one's arms. "You have become kings," she whispered, "but not yet men." In the evenings, the queen received visitors: abbots, widows, envoys, sometimes simple peasants with requests that made no distinction between heaven and earth. One woman came carrying a loaf of bread, still warm. "My son was sick," she said, trembling. "They said your prayer healed him." "It was your love that healed him," Clotilde replied. The woman fell to her knees, pressing the bread to the queen's hands. "Then let my love feed you." Clotilde accepted it gently. It already has. When the woman left, the maid said softly, "They call you a saint now." "Saints are those who forget themselves," Clotilde said. "I remember too much. That winter was the harshest in 20 years. The Loire froze at its edges, and wolves came down from the forests. In the villages, people burned furniture for warmth. In Tours, the monks melted down chalices to buy grain for the hungry. Clotilde sent wagons of food from her stores. "Tell them it is from the Lord," she said. "He only used my hands." Yet hunger has its own theology. In the markets, some muttered that the frost was punishment for sin, others that it was a test of faith. Children carved small crosses on their doors with bits of charcoal to keep death confused. On Christmas Eve, the Queen went to the cathedral. The air was so cold the candles struggled to stay alive. She knelt at the altar, her breath turning to mist. "Lord," she prayed, "you were born poor. Let my people survive poor." When she rose, a small boy had fallen asleep beside the nativity scene, curled in straw. She covered him with her cloak and left hers on him when she went home. As winter melted into spring, pilgrims began to arrive again. Merchants, farmers, women with infants, veterans of forgotten wars. They came to touch the tomb of Saint Martin and to find hope in the dust of his miracles. The Queen watched them from the colonnade, her hand resting on the cool marble. A crippled man crawled toward the door on his knees. A young mother whispered a prayer over the cradle she carried. "Faith," she murmured to the bishop beside her, "is a strange bargain. We give our pain and call it devotion. And what do we receive?" he asked. "A reason to keep breathing," she said. Theodoric's death came as the first true wound of her old age. The messenger arrived at dawn, mud on his cloak, eyes hollow. He did not speak. He only knelt and offered the letter. She read it once, slowly, tracing the letters with her finger as if she could keep him alive by touching his name. "He has returned to God," the messenger said softly. "No," Clotilde said. "He has returned to himself." That night, she did not sleep. She walked the corridors barefoot, her candle trembling in her hand. In the chapel, she knelt until her knees bled. "I gave him to you," she whispered to the crucifix. "Do not give him back in silence." The candle burned down to wax and went out. The darkness did not answer. The next morning, she went to the gardens. The dew was thick, the roses bowed under its weight. A young gardener paused in his work as she passed. "My lady," he said shyly, "they say your prayers reach heaven faster than the bells." She smiled faintly. "Then why does heaven take so long to answer?" The boy had no reply. She touched a rose and watched a petal fall. "It is not their fault," she said, almost to herself. "Even angels grow weary of war." Theodoric's funeral was held in Metz, but in Tours the people lit candles in every window. The river carried their reflections like a procession of stars. Clotilde watched from her balcony, her hands clasped. "So many lights," she whispered. "And yet the world grows darker." Years passed. Theodoric's son ruled in his place. Childebert and Clovis continued their uneasy peace. The Queen aged quietly. Her hands shook when she wrote. Her sight blurred at dusk, but her mind stayed sharp, and the letters still came. From Childebert, "I have built a hospice for the poor. The priests say the Lord will count it to my favor." From Clothar, "The nobles murmur of rebellion. I have reminded them that loyalty grows best in fear." She sighed as she read. "One son seeks heaven, the other seeks control. Both forget that mercy feeds more mouths than iron. In those final years, Clotilde spent her afternoons in the convent gardens beside the cathedral. Nuns tended herbs and roses, bees hummed among the lavender. The air was heavy with peace. Children from the city would sometimes slip in through the gates to bring her wildflowers. She would bless them and tell them stories of their fathers' fathers. "Do you remember King Clovis?" one boy asked. She smiled. "I remember the man. Kings are what history makes of men. I remember the laughter, the arguments, the dreams. Was he brave?" "Brave enough to fear God," she said. "And you, my lady? Are you brave?" She looked at the sky, where clouds drifted like slow ships. "I am brave enough to wait." That night, she dreamed again of the river. This time it was full of voices, the voices of her sons, her husband, her childhood, her faith. They did not call her name. They sang it, soft and endless. When she woke, she was weeping, and the dawn was already breaking. "Not yet," she said aloud. "Let me finish one more prayer." And she did. Outside, Tours was waking again. The city of bells and bread and prayers, where children played by the river and men argued over laws they barely understood. The queen stood by her window for the last time. The light touched her face gently, as though it too were saying farewell. She whispered, "The world will forget my name, but perhaps the river will remember my voice." And in the valley below, the Loire moved on, slow, bright, eternal, carrying her reflection toward the sea. The bells of Tours tolled for a long time after the queen was gone. Their sound crossed the Loire like a procession of invisible monks, climbed vineyard hills, washed against timbered houses, and returned from the far bank as a softened echo, as if the land itself were learning to answer prayer. In the basilica, wax bled in slow tears down the sides of candles. The nave smelled of frankincense and wet wool. Pilgrims knelt until their knees were islands of ache. Children fell asleep against the columns, their breaths a small chorus to the psalms. Childebert and Clothar stood side by side, not touching, not speaking. The bishop's Latin rose and fell like a steady river. When the chant reached Requiem Aeternam, the people answered in their rougher tongue, and for a moment the two languages braided like ropes, pulling the same boat. Outside, under a sky the color of hammered tin, a market went on at a respectful distance. Bread still had to be sold. Fish still had to be salted. A blacksmith still hammered iron into the shapes that keep hunger from winning. "The world doesn't stop," murmured Childebert, eyes on the coffin's oaken lid. "It only learns a new pace," said Clothar. They did not look at each other. After the funeral, the brothers received the city's elders in a chamber softened by tapestries and newly silent. Monks brought wine. Scribes waited with sharpened quills. The doors closed. "We declare a season of mercy," said Childebert, his voice gentle but practiced. "In honor of our mother, debts shall be forgiven where they crush rather than correct." "Mercy has borders," Clothar replied. "The wolves have learned our roads. Forgive too much, and they will learn our barns," a murmur. The elders shifted. The bishop watched, a still candle flame among gusts. "Let the churches feed the poor," Childebert continued. "Let the monasteries open their cellars." Clothar's gaze was iron-cooled in water. "And who feeds the churches?" The bishop lifted a hand, 2 fingers, blessing and caution both. "The Lord multiplies bread." "He does," said Clothar. "I have seen it." Men with shovels helped. Laughter broke the air's stiffness, grateful and guilty all at once. The season of mercy was proclaimed. In Paris, in Soissons, in the scattered seats of power dressed in villa or hall, bells announced remissions and tempered tithes. For a while, poverty felt seen. The Queen's death loosened a knot history had been worrying with its teeth. Letters quickened between courts. Envoys rode, priests weighed words like coins. The Lex Salica, the Frankish law, was read aloud in halls that smelled of oak smoke and ambition. Additions were debated, fines adjusted, inheritance tightened into channels that pleased thrones better than widows. Blood through sons, intoned a clerk, tracing the rule with ink that shone like small dark water. Blood through justice, corrected a deacon under his breath. Justice is a crown's other name, replied the clerk, not unkindly. On paper, it fits. The scribe who copied their quarrel into the margin drew a tiny wolf with a halo and did not sign his work. In Paris, Childebert made policy as artisans make lace. Loop by loop, patient, intricate, aware that one careless pull unravels hours. He sat long with bishops and abbots, listening to the slow grammar of conscience. He walked bridges at dusk, considering the price of salt and the shape of rumor. One evening, beneath a sky with the color wash of watered wine, he met with two men in the shadow of St. Stephen's new church. A bishop from Metz, whose eyes held both road dust and light, they called him Arnulf, and a courtier from the Low Countries whose name sat in his mouth like flint, Papin of Landen. A kingdom breathes in and out, said Arnulf, voice gentle, as if coaxing a skittish horse. When it inhales, it gathers men. When it exhales, it feeds them. Your laws teach how to gather. Teach also how to feed. Papin nodded but spoke to numbers. Grain stores, river tolls, the hire of roads. Your Majesty, if barns are measured and ferries regulated, famine becomes a miscalculation rather than a fate. And the church? Childebert asked. Let it preach charity, said Pepin. And audit it, said Arnulf softly. They smiled at one another with the peaceful rivalry of men who intend to share the same yoke. The king listened, held their names in his ledger of futures, and said only, Come to court in spring. Bring a plan that a miller could love. In Soissons, Clothar governed like iron learns to sing under a hammer. He woke before the bells, rode the yards, counted spears, inspected hinges. He knew the names of 10 smiths and the temper of their forges. He knew which captain drank and which priest gambled, and which both did neither, and was therefore the one to watch. The church grows fat, said a noble one morning, warming hands above a brazier as if truth caught fire there. Its barns are fuller than mine. Clothar watched smoke ribbon toward the rafters. Then carry grain from your barns to theirs, he said. Wheat feeds better than envy. But, said Clothar, turning, if I find a priest selling mercy like salt, I will close his mouth with iron. The noble bowed. The news galloped. In weeks, alms smelled better. Ledgers did too. Beyond the palaces, the country learned its new century with stubborn grace. In a village near Reims, an old woman named Elise sold talismans from a stall patched with sailcloth. Crosses carved from apple wood, knots of dyed wool against nightmares. A small coin tucked into the palm of a statue. For St. Martin's attention, she'd wink. That's bribery, laughed a young priest, stopping to warm his fingers at her brazier. That's remembrance, she said. God is busy. We send reminders, the priest wanted to argue. He bought a cross instead and gave it to a boy with a cough. The boy's cough got better, as coughs do when winter remembers how to leave. In Burgundy, vines thickened under prayers that mixed old and new. To the God who became bread, a vintner whispered, raising a cup to the morning, and to the earth that remembers his recipe. In monasteries, rules grew like hedges. Ora et labora, pray and work. Bells braided the day into beads. A novice in Marmoutier inked a psalm so carefully his breath forgot itself. In the margin, he drew a river coiling into a cross, and the abbot, seeing it, said nothing. Some metaphors choose you back. The court at Paris hosted a synod that spring, candles crowding like stars fallen to the table. Bishops debated how many coins could equal a sin, how many fasts could lean a heart back toward God, whether a man might own a relic the way he owned a field. "Relics own us," said Arnulf, smiling. The room exhaled. Childebert announced endowments, land for hospitals, tithes recalibrated to spare the small and shame the great. He drafted a charter in which the river tolls of 3 bridges would finance bread for the poor in late winter, when charity shivers and numbers lie. "Let it be written," he said. "Let it be done." The scribe, hands blotched, heart awake, wrote it. And for once ink felt like justice cooling into shape. Summer thickened. Cicadas learned the psalms, children bathed in the Seine, shrieking like angels who had just discovered water. Pepin of Landen came to court with ledgers and a humility that disguised its spine. He spoke to millers, to ferrymen, to widows counting coppers in dark doorways. He noted where roads drowned every spring and where barns leaked every truth. "If you would keep loyalty," he told Childebert on a twilight walk along the island's edge, "feed the rumors with bread." "And if I would keep you?" the king asked. "Give me work," Pepin said, "and the right to hire men who are hungrier for order than for praise." The king laughed, soft, surprised. "Then I give you a title we shall fill with meaning as we go. Mayor Domus. The great of the house, not to stand above bishops and princes, but to stand before the baker." Pepin bowed to the river and to the bread the river would carry. Somewhere upstream, a mill wheel caught more water than usual, as if history had leaned its shoulder into the current. Autumn returned with the color of forgiveness. Leaves loosened their hold, markets fattened with apples and stories. On the road between Soissons and Reims, a file of soldiers met a file of pilgrims, and each moved aside for the other, as if holiness and force had finally agreed on a lane. Clothar rode incognito through villages, a plain cloak over a patience not plain at all. He listened in taverns where straw remembered every spilled ale. He learned that a widow in Vitry had paid a priest for burying her child inside the church fence. He arrived unannounced, paid back the coins with interest, and sent the priest to peel potatoes for the brothers until spring. "You cannot buy heaven," he told the stunned congregation, "but you may hire me to pound a path toward it." Laughter, then cheers, then tears. The threefold economy of trust. Winter again. In Paris, Frost wrote delicate alphabets on windows that children tried to sound out. Childebert, older now, presided over a midnight mass where candles steadied the air. In the poorhouse he founded, a nun tucked a loaf under a blanket where a feverish man dreamed of wheat. A messenger arrived from the east with word of border stirrings, and from the south with news of a monastery whose abbot had made saints of his cousins. Men will always invent shortcuts to heaven, said Arnulf, shaking snow from his cloak. Then we will lengthen earth, said Pepin, stamping life back into his boots. Childebert smiled wearily at both. In his private book, kept where no scribe's neatness could embarrass his own hand, he wrote, between prayer and plan, a road. The last spring of their uneasy brotherhood bloomed honest and without politics. Lambs, rain, the glad vulgarity of mud. In a field near Chartres, peasants raised a small chapel from timber and goodwill. The priest blessed the ground in Latin. The farmer's wife sang thanks in a melody older than grammar. A child tied a blue ribbon around a post and called it the sky. Far away, in the half-ruined villa where Roman mosaic still remembered oceans of glass, a band of scribes gathered with Arnulf and Pepin. They spread maps and reckoned roads. They spoke of barns as if they were fortresses, of tolls as if they were liturgies, of bread as if it were policy and miracle both. What we start, Arnulf said, tapping a finger on the place where the muse bent like a hesitant sentence, will outlast our names if we set it in habit. Pepin nodded. Names are skins. Habits are bones. Word came that a relic, an ampulla with oil said to heal, had traveled from Rheims to Soissons to Paris, and with it came crowds. In their wake came thieves. Clothar cracked down. Childebert opened storehouses. The bishops argued about miracles as if God kept a ledger. A woman from the Loire arrived at the city gate with a child who would not speak. She had walked for days, slept under hedges, bribed no saints, promised heaven nothing. At the shrine she whispered, I do not ask for wonder. Only for a word the child pressed his hand to the stone, turned and said, Mother, as if the syllables were a door. The rumor traveled. The market felt gentler for a week. Even money clinked quietly, as if impressed. When Clotilde's final bequests were read, bread to hospitals, dowries to orphan girls, oil to lamps that burned too quickly, the poor of Tours lit candles in their doorways and set bowls of water by the threshold for the queen's thirst. In Paris, Childebert sat long in the twilight, the city a low hum of scents around him. He thought of his mother's hands, how they held letters as if the paper might bruise. We will make a foundation in her name, he told his scribe, not of stone only, but of habit. A rule for alms that survives our moods, and the scribe nodded, dipped his pen. Somewhere in the city, a baker made an extra loaf without knowing why. Years turn the way a millstone turns, slow, grinding grief into flour. Theudoric's line held the east. Clothar gathered. Childebert built and prayed. Pepin's quiet office grew muscle. Stewards, reeves, factors who knew the weights of grain and the weights of men. Arnulf wrote letters that sounded like sermons and walked like orders. In Metz, they began to say, his blessing felt like a fence you were grateful to live behind. Is this the beginning of something? Asked a young clerk, watching carts of grain move by schedule rather than accident. Everything is the beginning of something, said his master, but not everything remembers to end well. On the day the Seine flooded the quay and washed dovecotes clean, Clothar came to Paris to stand with his brother at the water's edge. The river asks no leave, Clothar said. It asks what we ask, said Childebert. Room. They stood in the rain and said nothing else for a long time. Then Clothar laughed once, the sound more human than royal. Do you remember, he said, how we used to race sticks from the bridge and call them boats? I do, said Childebert. You always chose the larger stick. Yes, Clothar said, and I always won. They watched a thatch of reeds go by like a small drowned chapel. When they parted, it was with a nod that knew both past and future, and made no treaty with either. In the year the apples were so sweet people forgave each other in orchards. A delegation came from a far monastery with a petition: land for a scriptorium, river rights for a mill, protection for pilgrims. They spoke to Pepin as if speaking to the king. They spoke to Arnulf as if speaking to conscience. The king signed. "You have made the church a pillar," said a noble sourly. "No," said Childebert. "I have given the roof more places to rest." "And who pays for the roof?" "Those who stand under it," said the king. And in the marketplace that answer cost less than bread and bought more than gold. The winter that followed drew lines around everything: fields, faces, choices. Clothar took ill and recovered as men of iron do, by refusing to learn how to be weak. Childebert lost a friend and built a chapel shaped like a memory he could not otherwise keep. Pepin hired a steward whose handwriting was so clear the numbers felt honest simply by standing near it. Arnulf baptized a child who would learn to bless kings, and the water ran from his small brow like a map no one yet knew how to read. In a tavern by the Meuse, a carter raised a cup and said, "We are better fed these days." "Luck," said one. "God," said another. "A man named Pepin," said the innkeeper, wiping the counter. They laughed, drank, and felt the floor steadier under their feet, without needing to know the names of beams. When at last the queen's memory thinned from fact into ritual, the cities marked her day with bread, the monasteries with an extra psalm, the mothers with a story told at bedtime about a woman who taught kings to pray with their hands. And the realm, made of wolves and rivers, of iron and altars, of law and rumor, breathed. It would not last. Nothing does. But in the breathing, habits hardened into bone. Mayors who steadied courts, bishops who steadied roads, kings who, some nights, let mercy steady them. A boy on a bridge in Metz watched the water and threw in a stick. "Race you," he told no one. And the stick went like a small brown future, turning corners he would one day learn to name. Night again. The Loire kept its vow. The Seine remembered psalms. The Meuse rehearsed the sound of mail and prayers spoken in the same breath. Somewhere in a scriptorium, a young monk wrote in a clean new hand, "Of the sons of Clovis and the roads they left, this much is certain. Bread and blessing walked together for a time. Iron and incense learned to share a roof, and men whose names begin softly will end by remaking crowns." He paused, dipped his pen, and in the margin drew a wolf beside a cross, both reflected in a river. The candle guttered. The script steadied. Outside, a cart rolled by bearing grain toward a granary, whose ledger would balance this time. The land slept as if it trusted its own breath. The land remembered her silence. After the Queen of Prayers was gone, the air itself seemed changed. Emptier, perhaps, or wiser. The bells of Tours no longer tolled in mourning. They tolled because life, like water, insists on movement. Spring came soft that year, with blossoms thick as snow on the apple trees. The Loire uncoiled from its winter dream, its waters fat and silver. Farmers walked the fields muttering both Latin prayers and pagan charms under the same breath, as if covering every possible ear in heaven. The sons of Clovis were aging. Childebert's beard had gone white. though his eyes still held the light of unspent thought. He spent his days not in war, but in building churches, hospitals, libraries. He called it armies of mercy. Clothar, older but less willing to show it, ruled from Soissons with the steadiness of iron. He had learned that cruelty ages faster than mercy. His captains still called him the Wolf, but in whispers now softened by respect. A wolf, he told them once, defends its den long after it needs it. We too defend old things out of habit. Perhaps that is what faith truly is, habit with teeth. In Paris, Childebert had built a great basilica on the hill of Saint-Germain. Its towers caught sunlight, like trumpets turned to heaven. Pilgrims came from the corners of Gaul to see the relics, to be healed, or simply to sleep within its stone belly and dream of forgiveness. In its shadow, new markets grew, sellers of wax, of herbs, of saints' medallions, of bread blessed at dawn. The people said the basilica breathed. Its bells were its heart. Every morning, Childebert would walk through those streets quietly, the hood of his cloak pulled low. He watched women carry water, children chase dogs, beggars warm their hands over barrels of coals. "This," he said once to his chaplain, "is the empire I can believe in, an empire of bread." In the countryside, life stitched itself back together. Farmers rebuilt cottages from the bones of Roman ruins. The walls of villas became barns. Marble columns stood now among vines. On the same fields where legions once drilled, oxen plowed and sparrows followed. Roads, once cracked and empty, were filled again. Pilgrims, traders, monks on mules, merchants with amber and salt. Every inn was a parliament of languages. Latin spoken in church Latin, in soldier Latin, in farmer Latin. Frankish rolling beside it, like thunder turned into speech. A monk from Marmoutier wrote home, "I travel through Babel, and yet I am understood." The Holy Spirit must be a translator. The monasteries became the new walls of civilization. In their scriptoria, young men bent over parchment by the dim breath of oil lamps. The scratching of quills filled the night like the soft rain of history rewriting itself. They copied psalms, gospels, laws, even old Roman poetry. They saved what the fire of time had almost devoured. Sometimes a scribe would pause, stretch his aching fingers, and look at the stars through the narrow window. "We are building a bridge," he'd whisper. "Each letter a stone." And when his ink froze, he would breathe upon it, as if warming the very word of God. Alongside them, the blacksmiths forged their own gospel in iron. In the forges of Soissons, hammers sang their slow hymns. Sparks rose like golden insects into the dark. The same iron that made swords now made plows, nails, hinges, bells. "Every blow," said one smith, "is a prayer." We turn war into work, bells cast from old weapons hung in churches across the realm. And when they rang, people said, "The swords are still singing." In Reims, Bishop Arnulf wrote to Pepin of Landen, "The faith of men now rests not in kings, but in the order of their barns." Pepin answered, "Then let us make the barns holy." It was not a jest. From this exchange, history would later trace the faint outline of a new dynasty. The Carolingian seed, still buried in the mud of anonymity. But at that time, they were only men who loved structure more than glory. Pepin had made himself indispensable. He organized grain routes along the Meuse and the Moselle, built bridges where ferries once sank, taught clerks to keep records by season, not whim. "The king commands," he told his stewards, "but habit governs." He rode rarely but listened constantly. Monks loved him for his fairness, merchants for his punctuality, soldiers for his silence. Once, in a tavern outside Noyon, a farmer said, "If God is in heaven, Pepin is in the ledger." The joke traveled farther than most sermons. Arnulf, meanwhile, grew into legend without meaning to. He preached not of wrath, but of patience. He taught that charity must be visible, like bread, or it rots. "A kingdom of prayers," he said from the pulpit, "is nothing if the hungry cannot hear them over their stomachs." He founded schools beside his churches, small rooms with slates and wooden benches. He taught Latin not as the tongue of the learned, but as the language of remembrance. "If we forget the words of those before us," he said, "we forget what mercy sounds like." His letters to Pepin became scripture for administrators. One begins, "Faith builds cathedrals, but order fills them." Theoderic's grandson, Theudebert, inherited Metz. He was young, ambitious, and restless. He minted coins with his own name and face, and on them he dared to write, "Rex Francorum et Romanorum." "The Franks and the Romans are one people," he said. "We have married the sword and the scroll." The bishops murmured. The courtiers watched. Arnulf said nothing, only smiled faintly. "He is not wrong," he told Pepin. "But he is early." Far from courts and councils, the land itself began to breathe differently. The forests of the Ardennes were thinner now, the fields wider. Villages clustered around wells and chapels, each with a saint's name painted above the door. Pilgrims carried bits of bone, bits of faith, bits of rumor. And in every village stories grew, of angels seen at harvest, of wolves tamed by the cross, of stars that changed color when the saints were near. "If belief cannot be seen," said an old monk to a doubtful novice, "then make it visible. Build it in stone," and so they did. Small churches rose like prayers made solid, rough, round, persistent. Language, too, was changing, quietly. Latin still ruled in the abbeys, but outside it was fraying into melody. A priest in Rouen wrote, "The peasants say Deo gratias as Deo gras." I correct them, and yet it pleases my ear. The seed of French was sprouting, unnoticed. At night, in cities and camps, fires burned low. The old soldiers told stories of Clovis, their father's king, the man who saw God in battle, who knelt in snow and was answered by light. "He tamed the wolf," said one. "He was the wolf," said another. A third, older still, spat into the fire. "He built roads for us to walk." That's enough, the flames hissed, and sparks climbed upward like the souls of unrecorded men. In his later years, Clothar grew quieter. His hall, once echoing with laughter and command, now filled with the hum of scribes, the shuffle of monks, the breathing of the wind through banners. One evening, he summoned Pepin. "You keep the kingdom breathing," he said, "but I feel the lungs failing." Pepin bowed his head. "Then we will teach it to breathe through others." Clothar studied him a long while. "You were not born to rule," he said, "and yet you rule." "I was born to count what others forget," Pepin replied. The king laughed, tired but true. "Then count me among them." Childebert died soon after, peacefully, in his basilica. The monks who watched said that, as his breath faded, the bells began to ring of their own accord. The people of Paris lit candles along the river, and their flames drifted with the current. Tiny, floating prayers heading toward the sea. After his death, the court fractured. Small kings, cousins, nephews, all raised banners and laws and grievances. But behind the noise, Two quiet men, Pepin and Arnulf, wove the invisible net of continuity. They kept roads open, granaries balanced, priests sober, scribes employed. History, said Pepin once, is a house built by accountants and haunted by poets. Then we shall be both, said Arnulf. And they were. In the monasteries, the monks began to write Historia Francorum, histories of the Franks. They wrote of Clovis and his baptism, of his sons and their wars, of Clotilda's prayers, of Theudoric's fortresses, of Clothar's temper, of Childebert's faith. They wrote of kings, but between the lines, they wrote of bakers, weavers, farmers, monks, lovers, those who truly carried the realm on their backs. And in one of these chronicles, written in a clear and careful hand, someone added, "The blood of Clovis runs now in the ink of Pepin." By the time Clothar's last son sat upon a throne, the Frankish realm had become less a kingdom than a rhythm, a pattern of roads, of laws, of seasons blessed and cursed in turn. The church was its memory, the barns, its heartbeat. The wolf had become a shepherd. In the next century, a new name would rise from that pattern, Carolus, the great, the learned, the crowned by the Pope. But before him, there would be another Pepin, grandson of the first, who would cross from service to sovereignty, from steward to king. And behind him, in the silence of the ages, the bells of Tours would still ring, as they had for Clotilde, as they had for Clovis, as they had for every prayer that learned to become policy. On the banks of the Loire, the river kept its patient counsel. At dawn, fishermen cast their nets. Children shouted in a language neither Roman nor Frankish, but something new, soft, bright, alive. A monk, old and near blind, sat by the water, his parchment spread on his knees. On it he wrote, "Of the sons of Clovis, it may be said, they began as wolves, they ended as shepherds. Between them, the world learned to speak." He paused, dipped his quill, and added a final line. "And though time devours kings, mercy endures." Then he closed his book, listened to the river, and smiled. For in its endless song, he heard the whisper of the next empire, already stirring, already dreaming. The river still flows, carrying the memory of kings and the prayers of those who lived beneath their crowns. The sons of Clovis have faded into history, but their echo remains in every cathedral bell, in every word we speak that was once born of Latin and faith. Thank you for walking beside me through these forgotten roads of Gaul. If you've been listening under the night sky, tell me, where in the world are you now? And what empire, what legend would you like me to whisper next? Until then, sleep gently and dream of rivers that never end.